The scripture reading will be from 2 Timothy chapter 1. That's 2 Timothy chapter 1, verse 5. 2 Timothy 1:5. When I call to remembrance the genuine faith that is in you, which dwelt first in your grandmother Lois and your mother Eunice, and I am persuaded is in you also.
It is good to see everyone here this morning. Certainly glad that you're with us. I want to open this morning with a question for you. How do you want others to see you? I know that many people probably have their impressions of us. We give off certain impressions, and it's probably one of the most major obstacles as we do this series is wanting to make the right impression or a good impression at that. But how do others see you? It's tough to get that reading, isn't it, sometimes, because we know how we think we look. But you think about this. Every person who meets another individual leaves some kind of an impression, whether that's a big impression and one that's more memorable, whether it's a small impression, it can be a good impression, it can be a bad impression, but every person that we meet, they're going to have some kind of an impression of us. And very often, others get a different impression than what we think we leave. And as we look at this morning, I want to, hopefully draw our minds to the way the Bible talks that we should ultimately behave, what kind of an impression we leave for not just other Christians, but for the rest of the world as well. When you look at 2 Timothy chapter 1 and verse 5, Paul writes this, and Doyle read it this morning. Paul writes this letter to Timothy, and he tells him, when I call to remembrance the genuine faith that is in you, which dwelt first in your grandmother Lois and your mother Eunice, I am persuaded is in you also. What encouraging words that must have been for Timothy. When you look at this verse right here, there's a few implications. Number one, Paul must have known his mother and his grandmother. Must have known, I don't know how close of a relationship they had, but he knew something about them. And he understood what kind of faith that his grandmother had. And then that faith was passed on to his mother, to Timothy's mother. And so Paul must have really understood and been very mindful of just what a righteous family this was. And there was something that they did that gave the impression to Paul that not just Timothy's grandmother and his mother were faithful in that vein, but that Timothy carried that on and he gave off the same kind of impression. And it was because of that impression that Paul chooses Timothy, takes him under his wing, and Timothy ends up spending quite a bit of time with Paul. In fact, Paul trusts him so much that he would leave him in different places. And when he wrote this letter to him, Timothy was in Ephesus. And so there was an impression that not just his grandmother, not just his mother, but that he made that really stood out with Paul. People take notice of you. And whether you like it or not, they're going to draw certain conclusions, or they're going to have certain thoughts of who you are, what they think of you. And it is up to us to really try to convey, to have a Christ-centered or a Christ-like impression that we're able to leave with other people. I can't force people to think differently of me than they do. There are some people that I need to be mindful of that may not treat me or may not think of me as highly as I either think they do or as I hope they do with me. But at the very least, I can try to be as good a Christian as I possibly can. There's nothing more that I can do. But we ought to, every day that we walk out of our home and every day that we meet new people, every day every week that we come to worship service, every time we leave worship service, we ought to be thinking about the impression that we could potentially leave with other people. That's why I want, as we look at these two things, there's two questions I want to get to this morning. as we look at just how, what an obstacle this can be in leaving an impression. Number one, what impression are we leaving as the church of Christ? And this is more of a collective impression that we leave. And then we're going to single it down to what kind of an impression are you leaving as an individual? Because there are things that in both categories that certainly people are going to take notice of. People are going to be attracted to it if we do it the right way. They're going to be drawn to us. They're going to want, we've been looking at the church at Ephesus during Bible class hour. And when you look at the first couple of chapters of Paul's letter to Ephesus, what a great job he does of building up the church, of building up the kingdom. And when you look at the Ephesians and who they were in the past and where they were when Paul writes this letter and how he really does try to encourage them, there was some kind of an impression that Paul must have made on them, not just teaching them about the truth, because there's something more that has to be done than just teaching someone about the truth. They have to see it. They have to experience it. They have to see, they're going to look at the people that are involved in teaching it. And they're going to look at the people that are, when we try to reach someone with the gospel of Christ, they're going to be analyzing our lives. And I have no hesitation in thinking that those people who are in Ephesus, who led a life for many years in idolatry and paganism, that they saw something in not just what Paul was preaching, of the hope that they could have, but they saw something in the character of Paul that drew them to him. There was a reason why they listened to Paul. There was a personality, I'm sure, that Paul had that really was attractive to many people. I think many people today try to draw him as this really harsh, kind of stern individual, and I've heard him described that way. But when you start reading his letters and seeing how much he really builds up the church of Christ and how much he loves souls, there was, you can't ask for someone better on your side than someone who wants to get you to heaven that much, and who will do absolutely anything they can. And sometimes those words, they penetrate us. They try to, sometimes they, make us angry. But when you look at just what they're trying to do and why they're trying to do it, the impression that they leave is everything with it. What kind of an impression then are we leaving as the church of Christ? As a collective body that we see, what are your big, I asked this, I pulled some groups from Facebook these past couple of weeks. So I always like to get a reading of just, what people are thinking out there. And I usually, when I do something like this, I pull a preacher's group. I also pull a group of, just members and of all different backgrounds as far as, they're members of the church, but they have, different kinds of backgrounds. They go to different places. They're different ages. They have different occupations and so forth, because I really like to get a good reading of what people think when I do these. And so I asked them two questions pertaining to this that I want to, as we look at the kind of impressions we leave with the church as the church of Christ. Number one is, what are your biggest turnoffs when visiting a congregation? Your biggest turnoffs, so what things that you're not impressed with, but then also what does impress you when you visit a congregation. When you look at what are the first things that you notice, what are the things that you remember most and make you want to return when if you were to visit a place. I want to go over their answers because I really think these are very telling, and it's probably a great representation of this congregation right here. Probably a great representation of anywhere, because these came from all over the place with the answers that they left. I want to start off with the biggest turnoffs when visiting a congregation. And keep in mind, these are no way meant for this congregation. I don't think anybody that I polled visited, maybe one or two of them, but I've already talked to them, and they love this congregation, and so you have nothing to worry about with them. But these are the biggest turnoffs, though, when people say, when they visit a place. Number one, and this is probably, I've heard this more than any. I had dozens of answers that came back. This is probably the number one answer that everyone, probably 90% of the people that responded to this said the very same thing or something very similar. The biggest turnoff when visiting a congregation is not being greeted, or people that are at that congregation just being so impersonal, not getting to know them, or even being unfriendly. And it was interesting as people were expanding on some of these that they would tell their story. They would visit a congregation, and they would either just completely be ignored. I remember one saying that they went in and they tried to, no one was greeting them, and so they went up to a couple of people and introduced themselves and said hello. And I guess we can do that if we go to a place, but we are a little bit, we're hesitant, are we? We don't know someone in a congregation. We're probably not going to be as inclined, unless you're really outgoing, to go up to someone else. But they mentioned how they went up to a couple of individuals that they assumed were members of the congregation, and so they introduced themselves, said hello, and these people turned around, said hi, and turned their backs right back around and just into conversation. And they said they felt so unwelcomed because of that, and that was the first impression. We always talk about how first impressions are, you only get one chance to make that first impression. And you think if that is the first impression that someone has in a congregation, are they going to be back? Are they going to want to come back to a place that to them just feels so cold or so impersonal? I had some people say that they actually had gone to congregations where they felt, where the people just seemed unfriendly. They just wouldn't talk to them for whatever reason. They wouldn't, when they asked them questions, they just kind of blew them off and so forth. And so that was the number one reason, just not being greeted. People want, when they walk in through those doors, they love, even if it's just hello and how and asking them how they're doing and so forth. I know people sometimes want to get right to their seats, but what a big thing that is when you start to consider it, that they love, especially people that don't know us, love to be greeted. They want to be noticed. They want people to, they want to walk into the church of Christ and feel like the church, that that all the church is unified as Christ wants it. And so that is probably the biggest turnoff that anyone had, and the number one reason of being turned off. Another turnoff that they said they had was poor song leading. This was probably just as, it wasn't nearly as much as the greeters, but they said the singing in a congregation, and I asked them to expand on that. What do you mean by poor song leader? The song leader either is just unprepared, or they don't know the songs if they get up, and that also no enthusiasm in the singing as well. It matters how we're devoted. We see in Ephesians 5:19, Colossians 3:16, how not only when we sing, we don't just sing praises, we sing praises to the Lord. And that ought to mean something to us. It ought to be very significant to us. When we sing these songs that are up here, when the song leader is leading them, that it should impact us. We're singing to God. We're not just singing to be heard. We're not just we're not singing to the other members. We're not just singing because of some routine that we do every single week, and we just look up and see the numbers and then just take part and all together for this. We are singing hymns and spiritual songs and psalms to the Lord. And when He's our audience, and when you really can be mindful that He's our audience, it changes the whole dynamic of how we approach singing. That He's the one that's listening to us. And He's the one that knows me personally, whether I'm putting everything I can into that song and singing to Him, or if I'm just kind of following along and just kind of going with everybody else. But that means something to Him. When Paul wrote that, it was singing to the Lord. And when people walk in, they can tell almost immediately really how enthusiastic a congregation gets in its worship. Are we doing that? The third one that people would say a lot, and this has, I'm doing this kind of aside from the preaching or the gospel and the truth that's being taught in and of itself, because that's going, and I'll hit that in just a second here. Another one that they said though that is kind of a turnoff is a poor website or information that's not available or not made available about the congregation. We live in a day and age now that people really do want to find out about us. They'll sometimes call ahead to make sure that we are a faithful congregation. I've gotten many calls in the past from people that they ask all the questions that you probably would expect. Do what's the singing like there? Do you use instruments or do you not use instruments? It's sad that you even have to call ahead now to ask things like that. You've probably, many of us have probably called ahead when we have visited other places. I hate that we have to do it, but you do it because we know that some probably aren't so faithful. But when they can go to a website, and we have the technology now to see what that congregation is like, and who we, and how we associate ourselves, and what activities are going on, it really does mean a lot. And that website really is a big thing now because it's just kind of it's kind of who we are in today's world. What a great chance that is to meet people or to put ourselves out there with it. But when they say a poor website, or if there's no information about the congregation, it's almost like they feel like the congregation just doesn't care, or they just have no self-pride or anything of what that is. The gospel preaching is the next, and that is probably almost just about as big as the greeting. Of course, people want faithful preaching. There better be faithful preaching. I mean, I'm on the hot seat every week, and I know, if I was one of the elders, that people deserve to hear the truth. In the same breath, don't just take what the Bible class teacher or the preacher, whether it's me or anyone else, because we've been to other congregations and have seen it, weigh the evidence to make sure that the truth is being taught, that the Bible is the center of that congregation. One of the things that in looking at the things that turn people off is they say they want preaching, not storytelling. I think it's okay to laugh. I don't find any fault in laughing sometimes, and when we come together. But that but the Bible, the Word of God, being the authority that it is far above anything else that we could ever do. Make sure they talk. When Paul was preaching, he got to know the people, and I'm sure they had great fellowship, and I'm sure they laughed together. He stayed in places sometimes for a few years, but the thing that he stressed the most was the gospel of Christ. That was what was going to save them. Storytelling isn't going to save anyone. It might entertain people for a little while, but make sure if there's something wrong if the Bible is not being taught every single week, every time someone comes into it. But it's not all bad. There were things that did impress people when they would go into a congregation. And the number one thing, as you can imagine, is being greeted. They loved it. It doesn't surprise me if the worst thing that they could ever they could think of is not being greeted, then of course being greeted, being noticed. People love the greeters at the door. They love ushers. I know we don't have people set out for being ushers, but what's neat is that if someone is here and they ask, hey, where can I sit? And someone is able to show them, you've done that work. And what a great thing that is. And people are going to remember that. And that's that goes along with it, is one of the things that people remember most, or that impresses them about a congregation, is being remembered if they are a returning visitor. Have you ever had that happen? How many in here have ever gone to a place more than once, by the way, and they remember who you are? They might not remember your name per se. I'm horrible with names, but I do remember faces, and I remember if I've seen someone. But if you are at least acknowledged, what a great thing that is. And it makes people feel like they are, that they're important and that they belong and that this is really a family. And we just are, sometimes we're a family that live in different places. But how great it is when someone can remember who you are, and you might have to tell them the name, but if they recognize you, and if we can recognize them, it makes a world of difference. We see this in Scripture. And it's no wonder that it is probably at the top of everyone's list today, because it was towards the top of everyone's list even in the first century. Look at Philippians Chapter 4 and verse 21, if you would. Paul stressed this, and it wasn't just in this letter, but this happened in several different letters that Paul wrote in different settings. Paul, in this particular one, in Philippians 4:21, writes, greet every saint in Christ Jesus. Greet every saint in Christ Jesus. That was so important to him because he knew that when you start greeting people, that's how the church is really going to grow close to one another, is when you can introduce them. Greet everyone, every saint in Christ Jesus. The brethren who are with me greet you. And then you look over at Romans 16:16, and we know this by heart. So many of us have used this for probably discussions, I'm sure, with people who are outside of the Church of Christ. But in Romans 16:16, Paul stresses, greet one another with a holy kiss. We don't do that anymore. This was a cultural thing back then. I know some people have tried to greet others with a holy kiss, and it doesn't go over so well. Not today. But when you look at the context of what this is and what was taking place, this would sort of be the equivalent of what a handshake would be. Back then, it was just they were a little more open as far as it didn't mean the same thing then as it probably means today, or how you might take it today. But when you look at this, though, he says, greet one another, though, with the holy kiss. The churches of Christ greet you. And what a great impression that makes on people when they walk in and know that they are welcomed that much, and when you're that excited and happy to see them. And of course, we go somewhere, what a great thing it is when they see it. Bible teaching is number 2. And again, when they can stay straight to, they were talking about how when they can stay straight with the Bible teaching, not storytelling, not entertaining for anything, that they know they're in the right place. A clean building came up in it, and signage. And I'm going to put those two kind of together, and I know they're not always together, but they go kind of hand in hand, I guess. But you look at a clean building, people notice when when members take pride in what they mean. And that by pride I don't mean arrogance, but when we care about the place where we come and worship, and we care enough to make it look good for other people that might come in who've never been here before, there's a certain there's a certain attraction with that. A lot of people won't go to a building that just looks dingy, or they just seem like they don't care, or just it smells funky, or whatever the case might be. But they do notice it when they come in, and it is clean, and it's well lit, and it's the floors are vacuumed, and the garbage is taken out, and we have such great people that help in these capacities. You walk into the restroom, and it's not a mess in there. People care about that. And when there's signage up, they love it. When there's signs on the door, are easy to navigate wherever they need to take their children, because their children come in and they care about having those children's classes, or the signs up on the wall, what might be taught at that time. And so this the building, it's just a tangible. And we might see it as just simply a place that we meet, but it means so much more than you probably realize, to people that come and visit us. And you've probably noticed it as well if you've gone somewhere else. You know if they've cared or not cared about where they worship. And then with going along with how they don't like the no information. One of the things they said they love is a clear and easy way to find information online. It is a great way to let people know who we are. They see, we have sometimes a resource page with different people that, Apologetics Press, or we have different, websites that, and they are able to see right off the kind of material that we would teach. And they're able to see the activities that are going on. They're able to see different, just different photos, or with different events. It does make a difference with all of this. And so the impressions that we leave as the church in areas we probably don't think about all the time really do make the sounding impressions and long-lasting impressions on different people. When they come in, though, make sure that they're greeted. I know sometimes we get distracted, or we get to talking to someone and we can't greet every single person all the time. For all of us. But if you see someone, say hello. That could be everything. Is just to ask them, especially if you don't recognize them. They have no idea if you're a member or not, unless obviously they're a member here. But to have someone come up and greet them and just be respectful and treat them and welcome them means the world. What about the impressions that you make, though, as an individual? What message are you sending to others when you see them? Do you think about it? Because you are making some kind of an impression to someone else every time you meet them. In Ecclesiastes chapter 7 and verse 1, Solomon writes, "A good name is better than precious ointment." A good name. What is your name to someone? When they think of who you are, because they're obviously, if they know who you are, and your name comes up, they're going to immediately think of you, and they're going to immediately think of something, they're going to connect something to you. Whether whether they respect you, whether they like you, whether you really mean a lot to them, or sadly, just the opposite of whatever that is. But what do you do to try to leave that impression to them? Last week, we talked about the words that we say. I'm not going to go there again. You can listen to that if you would like, but obviously our words are sometimes that first impression, and they're going to notice the words that we say with it. But I want to go beyond that, because aside from what we say, we also leave an impression on how we look. In other words, how do you dress? Do you realize that the clothes that you wear and how you wear them communicate something? You're telling someone something simply by the way that you dress. You wear sports T-shirts all the time. They're going to realize that you're probably a big sports fan and of a particular team. You wear work clothes all the time, wherever you're from. They're going to see that. They're going to see what kind of an individual you were, and probably how hard of a worker, or they're going to at least sort of make that reference to it. But the clothes that we wear do demonstrate something. They demonstrate our culture, the mood. They're going to demonstrate the esteem that we have in ourselves, whether or not we consider ourselves respectable, or if we're what we want to be looked at respectfully. It's going to demonstrate the interests that we have. It is going to demonstrate, to an extent, our age. I want nothing more than to bring back 80s fashion. I love the 80s, and I'm not afraid to say it. But I know that there are people that would never, ever let me out of the house if I started dressing that way. But it does demonstrate our age, doesn't it, with the way that we dress. There's so many different things. It definitely demonstrates the values that we have, the morals that we have. There are some who know exactly the directive that they want to send. When they walk out of the house, whatever clothes they're wearing, they know the directive that they want to send. They know if they want to attract someone, they're going to wear something that might attract people. And the problem is that it may attract all the wrong people. There are others that are so influenced by culture that they just do not realize it. They're not mindful of it. And that's why it's so important when we go out that we do think about what kind of a message that it could convey. I want to read you something, and it's specifically as we talk about this, with dress. And modesty does come up. And especially with, a lot of the times, I guess not all the time, I don't want to say that because it's not fair to say all the time, but, with girls and young girls in particular, and the way that the media has just done horrendous things with trying to convey a certain look and a certain attitude, and that if you wear, you're not going to be noticed unless you wear this or this or this. I want to read you something, a quote by a supermodel in the 80s named Kim Alexis. Some of you may be familiar with who she is. She was a huge supermodel in the 80s. She was on over 500 magazine covers, including Vogue, and she was on the front of the Sports Illustrated swimsuit edition. They asked her not too long ago about about her body of work, and she had this to say. She said she wanted to make it very clear the mistakes that she had made back in that time when she was probably at the peak of her career. She said, many women are playing with fire in the way that they dress. Dressing like a floozy tells the world, look at me, want me, lust after me. I'm easy and you can have me. Displaying intimate parts of the body, she says, is a form of advertising for sex. That was someone who came out of that. Folks, how you dress matters. And how people look at you and the impression that you give, and especially as a Christian, especially as a Christ lover or professing to love him, it matters the way that you dress. Because people are going to they're going to make a decision on how they think of you and what impression they have of you. And going along with something like this, we can ask, would you wear what you wear in front of Christ? You see, representing him in the best possible way starts with what we say, with what we wear, with how we look. And people are going to notice. How do you act? The way we act, the things we do, the way we behave are things that people are going to notice. It's going to leave an impression with someone. If you didn't tell someone that you were a Christian, could they tell that you were one? Do you carry the characteristics? Are you trying to, at least if they finally did find out, that they could say, you know what, I'm not surprised. There's something about you. With whom are you spending all your time? Company we keep says a great deal about us. Does a company that you keep, are they able to try to get you to heaven? Are they trying to get you to heaven? What are they doing to try to encourage you to get to heaven? You see, the company we keep sets an impression for different people. And I know we can say, oh, they're just my friends. That's great. I think it's important to have friends. I think it's important to have friends that will support you in this life. We need people that get us, or that we think understand us when we think others might not. But are they able to help you get to heaven? You see, that's an impression. With the company that we keep, we give an impression to other people. And you think even younger people are able to leave an impression. Paul, in his first letter to Timothy, understanding that Timothy was younger, we don't know how young, but he tells him, 1 Timothy 4:12, let no one despise your youth. Timothy, don't let anyone look down on how old you or young you are, but be an example to the believers in word and in conduct, in love, in spirit, in faith, and in purity. And folks, this happens at a very young age. Children that are preteens can start doing these kinds of things and setting the examples to adults or older children or other children that their same age. Be an example to the believers in word. How do you be an example in conduct? What are you doing? The decisions that you make. Parents have a big part to play in this, to encourage your children. Not just to yell orders at them, not just to be a dictator, but to really set the example for them and encourage them for when they go out of the house. There are questions that we can ask on any given thing that we do or say. Number one, with whatever we do, ask, does it glorify the church, or would it bring reproach against the church? Number two, would it help? What am I doing help, or would it hurt the footing that I have as a Christian? Number three, is there anything that I should be doing better or differently to make the right impression that Christ would be proud of in me? You see, all of these different things that we've been talking about, whether it's with the church or if it's with an individual, They don't just matter. It doesn't just matter with the impression that you make to other people, because you're making an impression to Christ as well. He's looking down at us, and he's looking at you personally and what you're doing about it. Friends, if there is something that you need to correct, or if you're not a Christian and want to find out why these are so important, I want to encourage you this morning to make things right if it's needed, and to come forward as we stand and sing this song of invitation.